The first thing I noticed at 5:52 inches the morning was that the freezer compressor in the west side location had kicked into a frequency I didn't like. Not loud enough to trip an alarm, just a half step off from where it should be. The kind of thing you only hear after 16 years of listening to a building breathe. I was crouched behind the server closet with a flashlight between my teeth and a diagnostic cable in my hand, trying to figure out why 3 of our 12 locations had dropped off the POS network overnight, and somewhere between tracing a faulty switch and wondering if the overnight manager had unplugged something again to charge his personal laptop, I had no idea that in exactly 4 hours and 11 minutes, I would be sitting in a conference room listening to a 26-year-old explain that my position had been eliminated. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 51 years old, and for 16 of those years I was the director of IT and systems operations for Cornerstone Kitchen, a regional restaurant chain that started as one location on the edge of downtown with a hand-painted menu, a borrowed cash register, and a Wi-Fi router that went down every time someone in the kitchen ran the industrial blender. When I joined, there were 11 employees and a founder named Gerald Abrams who called me every morning at 7 because he genuinely believed I could fix things from my living room by thinking very hard about them. By the time I cleaned out my desk, there were 12 locations, 460 employees, a loyalty program with 183,000 members, and a new chief technology officer who, as best I could tell, had learned everything he knew about restaurant infrastructure from a podcast he found on a flight to Austin. His name was Derek Abrams, Gerald's son, 26, freshly armed with an MBA from a school whose athletic program I recognized better than its business department, and the absolute unshakable confidence of someone who had never once in his life stared at a server rack at 6 in the morning, wondering why half the state couldn't process a credit card. He wore fitted quarter-zip pullovers in colors that didn't have names yet, and spoke about things like frictionless guest experiences and tech-forward dining ecosystems. The first week he was there, he asked me if our point-of-sale system was, quote, scalable to blockchain integration. I told him I'd look into it. I did not look into it. Gerald had brought Derek in quietly, the way you introduce a new puppy to an older dog gradually, with careful attention to body language and an eye on who might bite. For about 3 months, Derek sat in on my infrastructure reviews, asked questions that ranged from genuinely insightful to deeply concerning, and I gave him the same patience I'd given every vendor rep and junior hire who came through that door, without knowing the difference between a static IP and a punch in the mouth. Gerald had built something real. I respected what Gerald had built. If his kid wanted to learn, I'd teach him. What I didn't realize was that Derek wasn't there to learn. He was there to replace me. There are things you do over 16 years for a company that never make it into a job description. When Gerald opened his second location, the bank wouldn't extend a business line of credit fast enough for us to get onto a commercial cloud hosting plan. So I set up the AWS account in my name and we billed it through my corporate card on reimbursement. I told Gerald we needed to transfer the account ownership as soon as we stabilized. He said, absolutely. Remind me next month. I reminded him the next month. He said, end of quarter. I put it in my annual review, 3 years running, as a pending administrative priority. The response was always some version of, we'll get to it. Marcus, you know how the back office stuff piles up? And eventually I stopped raising it because the operational answer was the same. Either way, I managed the account, I kept the lights on, and whether my personal email was the account recovery address was the kind of thing that only mattered if something went very wrong. Same story with the domain registrar. Same story with the loyalty platform, a vendor called Clear Reward that we'd been with since location 3. And whose master account had been opened with my personal information, when Gerald couldn't get the business verification documents together in time for our soft launch. Same story with the POS vendor's enterprise licensing portal, where my social security number was on the original contract because, in 2008 when we signed it, Cornerstone Kitchen did not have sufficient business credit history to satisfy their underwriting requirements. And Gerald had looked at me across a booth at a Denny's and said, Marcus, I will make this right, I promise. And I had believed him, because back then, when it was the 2 of us and a dream and a blender that kept crashing the router, it felt like a family. Families change. The meeting invite arrived on a Thursday at 4:43 inches the afternoon. Subject line, touch, base HR plus, leadership. No agenda, no context. Just 2 names in the attendees field. Myself and a woman from HR named Patricia, who I'd met twice, and both times she'd asked me how to spell my last name. My stomach did something it hadn't done in a long time. I finished what I was working on, saved everything, and drove home slowly. The next morning, I wore my good shirt. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because if I was about to be told 16 years of my life were being reorganized out of existence, I was going to sit in that room looking like I already knew what was coming. I was in my office chair by 7, ran through the morning system checks, confirmed the 3 locations from the night before were back online, and at 9 o'clock I walked into the glass-walled conference room on the 2nd floor where Patricia was already seated, and Derek was standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the parking lot like he was posing for a magazine spread about difficult leadership moments. Patricia did most of the talking. Words like restructuring and evolution of the role and skill set realignment. Derek nodded occasionally with the practiced gravity of someone who had watched a lot of executive coaching videos. The severance package was 2 months, a reference letter, and continuation of health benefits through the end of the calendar year. The paperwork had my name on it, spelled correctly, which I noted with more bitterness than I expected. "We need to collect your equipment today," Patricia said. "Laptop, access badge, company phone, and all system credentials, passwords, admin logins, everything documented in the transition file we sent you last week." I looked at Derek. He looked back at me with the steady, carefully arranged expression of someone pretending not to feel bad about something. The transition file had been sent to me 6 days earlier, which meant this had been decided at least 6 days ago, which meant every conversation Derek and I had in the last week about infrastructure planning had been theater. I thought about that for a moment. Then I opened my bag and started going through the list. I handed over the laptop, the badge, the company phone in its case. I pulled up the transition document and went through every system, every password, every admin credential they had listed. I was thorough. I was professional. I gave them exactly what they asked for. What they asked for was everything on that list. They did not ask about the list itself. They did not ask whether the list was complete. They did not ask who owned the accounts those passwords accessed, or whether the root recovery credentials for those accounts led somewhere other than a Cornerstone Kitchen email address. "You sure you have everything you need?" I asked, when we'd reached the end of the document. Derek said yes. I said okay. I picked up my bag and walked out through the lobby past the motivational canvas print of a plate of food, with a sunrise behind it that I had helped Gerald hang 12 years ago when we moved into this building, and I pushed through the door and stood in the parking lot in the September air and felt the strange, specific silence of a person who has just been handed the last chapter of something they spent 16 years writing. I did not drive home. I drove to a coffee shop 4 blocks away where the Wi-Fi was reliable and the booths were deep and quiet, and I ordered a large black coffee and sat down and called my friend Janet. Janet Okafor and I had gone to high school together in a city neither of us lived in anymore. She was now a technology and intellectual property attorney, the kind of lawyer that large companies paid very seriously to explain to them why they had made very expensive mistakes. We had dinner every few months, and she had been advising me informally for years on the administrative mess of those unresolved account ownerships, because she'd always told me it was a liability exposure, and I'd always agreed. With her, and neither of us had pushed hard enough to get it resolved. "Janet," I said when she picked up, "they let me go this morning." A pause. Then, "The accounts." "Yeah, the AWS account, the domain, the loyalty platform, all of them." Another pause. Longer this time. Then a low, slow exhale that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "Marcus, tell me you saved those emails." "I did," I said. "Every one. 3 formal requests to transfer account ownership, all unanswered. All in my sent folder." She was quiet for a moment in the way that attorneys get quiet when they are not feeling sympathy but are instead running calculations. Then she said, "You know, you have a legal obligation to notify those vendors of your change in employment status." "I know, especially given that your personal identifying information, including your social security number, is attached to some of those accounts. If there's a data breach or a billing dispute, you have direct liability exposure." "I know that too. So notifying them isn't revenge. It's responsible." I picked up my coffee. "I want to do this right, Janet, by the book. Nothing aggressive. Nothing that looks like I'm trying to cause harm." "I know you do. That's why I'm going to help you. Give me an hour and I'll draft the letters." I sat in that booth for 3 hours. I read the vendor terms of service for every platform. I reviewed the account ownership documentation. I pulled up the email chain from my 3rd and final request to transfer the AWS account sent 14 months ago, CC'd to Gerald directly, responded to with a thumbs up emoji, and never followed up on. I sat with the quiet, particular feeling of a man who has spent 16 years doing the right thing and is about to do it one more time, and the right thing just happens to have consequences. I am not a vindictive person. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what I'm about to tell you. I did not file those notifications out of anger. I filed them because Janet was correct. I had legal liability tied to those accounts, and now that I was no longer affiliated with the company, allowing them to continue operating under my credentials and my personal information without proper notice was the kind of thing that could follow me for years. The right thing to do, from a personal liability standpoint, was to formally notify each vendor of my employment termination, request a suspension of account activity pending ownership transfer, and document everything. So that is what I did. The AWS notification went out first. Standard account review request, citing change in account holder employment status, requesting hold on new resource provisioning pending transfer of account ownership. The domain registrar received a formal change of status notification, noting that I was no longer affiliated with the organization, and requesting that any renewals or modifications be paused until an authorized business representative contacted them with proper verification. The Clear Reward loyalty platform received the most detailed letter because their terms of service were the most specific about account holder liability, and Janet had drafted something that was polite, precise, and about as legally immovable as a load of wet concrete. Each letter was sent certified. Each letter was CC'd to Janet. Each letter noted that the account holder had previously attempted to arrange ownership transfer on documented occasions and provided the relevant email correspondence as attachments. Then I drove home. I ate leftover chili. I watched baseball. My phone was quiet. It stayed quiet for 2 days. On the third day, it was not quiet. I was reorganizing my home office when my personal cell rang with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from someone named Andrew, who identified himself as Cornerstone Kitchen's new IT consultant, asking in an extremely controlled voice if I might be available for a brief call regarding some account access challenges they were experiencing. I called Janet first, then I called Andrew back. He explained that they had encountered some unexpected issues with their cloud infrastructure and their POS licensing portal and their loyalty platform and their domain management account, and he was hoping I might be able to clarify some account hierarchy questions. He had the careful, slightly damp tone of a professional who has just been handed a situation that is significantly worse than the person who handed it to him had described. I walked him through the ownership structure patiently and completely. I explained exactly why those accounts were in my name, the history of the setup, the previous request to transfer. I told him that I had notified the vendors as a matter of legal responsibility and that I remained willing to cooperate fully with any ownership transfer process. I told him that each platform had a formal transfer protocol and that the timeline would depend on how quickly Cornerstone Kitchen could provide the required business verification documentation to each vendor. That could take, he said carefully, 2 to 3 weeks per platform. It could, I agreed. In the meantime, I said, the platforms are operating in a limited access status, which is standard procedure when an account ownership dispute is flagged. That's the vendor's policy, not mine. I'd recommend contacting each one directly. He thanked me. I could hear in his voice that he was going to need a drink after this call. My phone rang again 40 minutes later. The screen said, Gerald Abrams Mobile. I looked at it for a moment. I thought about the Denny's booth. I thought about the borrowed router and the hand-painted menu, and the morning Gerald called me from his car at 7 a.m. because a health inspector had shown up early and the online compliance documentation system I'd built wouldn't load, and he'd said, Marcus, I don't know what I'd do without you. I thought about all of that. Then I answered, Gerald, it's been a while. Marcus, what is happening? His voice had the sandpaper edge of a man who had just discovered that something he thought was handled had never been handled. What did you do? I want to be honest with you, Gerald. I notified our vendors of my employment termination because I have legal liability attached to those accounts, and I'm no longer affiliated with your company. Your team fired me 3 days ago. I have an obligation to protect myself. You shut down our systems. I didn't shut down anything, I said. I notified vendors of a change in account holder status. The limitations you're experiencing are their standard protocols. They're protecting themselves too, Marcus. He exhaled hard. We have a loyalty database with 183,000 customers. We have POS systems at 12 locations. We are in the middle of our fall campaign. This is a situation that could have been avoided, I said. If the 3 emails I sent requesting account ownership transfer had been addressed, I have those emails, Gerald. I have the dates. I have your son's thumbs up emoji from 14 months ago. I did not create this problem. Silence. The long kind. The kind where someone is realizing that the story they walked into a conversation with is not the story that's actually here. We need to fix this, he said finally. What do you need? You need to initiate transfer requests through each vendor's business verification process, I said. Your legal team should be able to handle most of it. For the AWS account, the transfer is more involved because of how the infrastructure was originally architected. That one will likely require hands-on guidance. He asked me what that would cost. I told him my consulting rate. It was not my old salary divided by hours. It was my rate as an independent consultant with 16 years of infrastructure experience who had just spent the better part of a week documenting the ownership history of a complex multi-platform environment. It was $310 an hour, and it was fair, and we both knew it. He said that was acceptable. I said I'd send a contract. I want to be very clear about what happened next because I've told this story a few times and I don't want anyone thinking I dragged it out or made things harder than they needed to be. I didn't. I showed up on time to every session. I documented everything clearly. I walked the new IT team through the transfer process with the same patience I'd given every junior hire for 16 years. When we hit a complication with the Clear Reward transfer because their verification team needed original incorporation documents and Derek had somehow stored those on a local drive that nobody could find, I spent 2 extra hours helping them locate a digital backup rather than telling them that was their problem. I did the job right because that's who I am. Every invoice had my name on it, spelled correctly. Marcus Webb. 2 syllables. Not hard. By the 4th week of consulting engagements, Gerald asked me, quietly, at the end of a call, whether I had ever thought about coming back on a part-time basis as a senior advisor. I thought about Tyler from HR in his Patagonia vest. I thought about Patricia asking me to spell my last name. I thought about Derek by the window, hands in his pockets, looking at the parking lot like he wasn't about to dismantle someone's career without the basic decency to look them in the eye. I thanked Gerald for the offer. I told him I'd found that I preferred working for clients who read their vendor agreements. There was a beat. Then he said, quietly, I'm sorry, Marcus. I should have taken care of those transfers. I made a promise. I know you did, I said. I let him sit with that. What I didn't tell Gerald was that by the time he made that offer, I already had 4 clients. Not restaurant groups, a healthcare network, a mid-sized law firm, a regional credit union, and a commercial real estate company, all of whom had heard through a mutual contact in the local business community that there was a 51-year-old infrastructure specialist who had built and managed 12-location multi-platform systems for 16 years and was now available for consultation. 2 of those referrals had come from Walt, who had been my vendor rep at the POS company for 9 years and who had called me the week after the notifications went out and said, Marcus, I heard what happened, and I know 3 companies that need someone like you. I wrote his name in my phone and underlined it twice. I hear from people sometimes who are surprised that I don't talk about this with more heat. No anger, they say, no celebration. I tell them I celebrated on the drive home from the last Cornerstone consulting session when I stopped at the same coffee shop where I'd called Janet and ordered the same large black coffee and sat in the same booth and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific weight of clarity, the feeling of a man who knows exactly what he's worth. My home office has a wall. On that wall, next to a photograph of my father in his shop and my first paycheck from 1997, I mounted a small shelf. On that shelf, I keep 3 things. The original Cornerstone Kitchen business card Gerald gave me in 2008 when he promoted me from systems technician to IT manager, the printed cover page of my first independent consulting contract, and a small framed printout of that 14-month-old email I sent requesting account ownership transfer, the one with the thumbs up emoji response at the bottom. Not as a wound, as a lesson. My father used to say that the people who keep the machines running are never the ones who get the speeches. They're the ones who get the calls at 2 in the morning. They're the ones who know which wire is which and where the backup lives and what happens to the whole system if you pull the wrong thing at the wrong time. He spent 31 years as an electrical contractor and retired with a handshake and a gift card to a steakhouse. And I asked him once if he was bitter about it, and he looked at me with the patient expression of a man who has worked too long to have energy for bitterness, and said, Son, The work knows what it's worth even if the people paying for it don't. Eventually, the lights go out and they remember. Eventually, they always remember. My consulting firm is called Backbone Systems. The name came to me while I was sitting in that coffee shop booth on the afternoon they fired me, coffee going cold, thinking about all the invisible things I'd held together for 16 years. Backbones don't get press releases. They don't get corner offices or quarterly bonuses or quarter zip pullovers in colors without names. They get quietly, completely relied upon until the moment someone decides they're no longer necessary, at which point the whole structure discovers very quickly what it was built on. I have 7 clients now. I set my own hours. Every contract I sign, I review the account ownership clauses first. I ask the right questions up front. I have a checklist that I built from memory. Every item on it a lesson I learned the hard way or watch someone else learn the hard way, and I share it with every new client because I'm not interested in creating another situation like Cornerstone. I'm interested in making sure that the people who keep systems running are properly documented, properly credited, and properly protected, and that the companies relying on them understand what they have before they decide they no longer need it. The loyalty database transferred cleanly. The domain is in Cornerstone's name now. The AWS infrastructure runs under proper corporate credentials. Derek has apparently hired a decent operations team, and things are largely functional, which I am genuinely glad to hear because those 183,000 loyalty program members didn't do anything to deserve a service disruption, and neither did the 460 people who work those locations every day. Gerald sent me a birthday card last November, handwritten. He said he thought of me every time he renewed a vendor contract. He said I had been foundational. He used that exact word, and I read it twice, and then I put it in the desk drawer next to my father's old business cards, and I went back to work. That's the thing about being foundational. It means something is built on top of you. It means when you go, the structure has to reckon with what was holding it up. It doesn't feel good, that moment of reckoning. Not for anyone. But it is, in the end, honest. And honest is something I have been every single day for 16 years for a company that forgot to return the favor. They wanted a clean break, a smooth transition. They wanted to move in a new direction and leave the old infrastructure behind. What they forgot was that infrastructure doesn't disappear just because you stop looking at it. It stays right where it's always been, doing exactly what it was built to do, waiting patiently for the moment you need it again. I made sure they remembered that, and then I moved on.